Right back for another deep dive. And this one might get a little uncomfortable. We love digging into organizational behavior and all, but you've been exploring Larman's laws with us. And, well, this time we're going beyond the basics to uncover some seriously unexpected implications.
Unexpected in what way?
Maybe even controversial.
Ooh, I like where this is going. What's fascinating about Larman's laws is they don't just describe how organizations work. They expose the often hidden power dynamics that drive decision-making, especially when it comes to change.
Okay, so anyone just joining us,
Yeah.
can you give us a super quick rundown of Larman's laws?
Sure, they're a set of 9 principles.
9.
Yeah, developed by Craig Larman, an expert in organizational behavior and agile development. And, he doesn't sugarcoat things.
I see.
These laws highlight the less glamorous, sometimes messy reality of how companies operate, often challenging those feel-good business buzzwords we hear all the time.
Okay, so let's get into the uncomfortable stuff. One of the laws that really caught my eye is the one that states, culture follows structure.
Right.
This seems to go against the popular saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right. It's a direct contradiction of that popular notion.
What are your thoughts on this?
But Larman's point is that you can't just create a culture of innovation with pep talks and beanbag chairs.
Right.
If the underlying structure, things like reporting relationships, decision-making processes, and how resources are allocated doesn't support innovation, it simply won't happen.
Are you saying the structure is the soil and the culture is what grows from it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a company trying to become more customer-centric, but their structure still rewards employees for hitting internal metrics.
Okay.
Instead of customer satisfaction, no amount of culture building will overcome that fundamental misalignment.
So all those team-building exercises and company retreats, are they essentially pointless if the underlying structure doesn't support the desired cultural shift?
Well, they're not pointless,
Okay.
but they have very limited impact if the structure is working against them.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another often overlooked and perhaps surprising implication of Larman's laws: the role of middle management.
I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah.
We often hear about visionary leaders and innovative employees.
Right.
But what about the folks in the middle?
Well, here's where it gets a bit controversial.
Okay.
Larman's laws suggest that middle management often becomes the biggest obstacle to innovation.
Interesting.
And the reason is structural.
You mean it's not because they're inherently resistant to change or anything like that?
Not necessarily. Their position within the existing power structure incentivizes them to maintain the status quo.
Okay.
Their power budgets and teams,
Yeah.
all of that is tied to how things currently work.
So any initiative that disrupts that, even if it's for the benefit of the company, might be seen as a personal threat.
Precisely. Think about how promotions often work.
Okay.
You move up the ladder by mastering the existing system.
Yeah.
Suddenly someone comes in with a new way of doing things and it can feel like the rug is being pulled out from under them.
I bet that's got to be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
Yeah.
The folks at the top want change. The people on the ground might be eager to try new things.
Right.
But middle management gets stuck in the middle.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is where those superficial agile transformations come into play.
Okay.
Companies adopt the look and feel of agile stand-up meetings, Kanban boards, maybe even a chief agile officer.
Oh, wow.
But they don't address the underlying structural issues that Larman highlights.
So they're basically putting on a show.
Kind of.
What are the real-world consequences of this agile illusion? Have you seen examples of this?
Oh, absolutely. I worked with a tech company that went all in on Agile, but they kept their traditional hierarchical structure and performance review system.
Interesting.
Teams were supposed to be self-organizing, but in reality, managers still held all the decision-making power.
So people were going through the motions of Agile, but the underlying power dynamics remained unchanged.
Yeah.
What happened?
It created a ton of confusion and frustration. Employees felt disempowered, managers felt threatened, and the whole Agile transformation ended up backfiring.
It's like buying all the fancy workout gear, but never actually going to the gym.
Exactly.
Oh, man. This reminds me of another one of Larman's laws, the one that states, any change initiative draws criticism from those whose power or status is threatened.
Right.
I guess this ties in with the resistance we often see from middle management, but could we go even deeper?
Sure.
Is it really always about a fear of losing power?
It's often the primary driver, but there's more to it. Change can be incredibly unsettling, even for those who aren't directly threatened by it. It disrupts familiar routines, introduces uncertainty, and requires people to step outside their comfort zones.
So even well-intentioned initiatives, even those that ultimately benefit everyone, are going to face pushback simply because change is hard.
Exactly. It's human nature to resist the unknown, especially when you've invested time and energy building a career within the existing system.
And this brings us to a pretty provocative question, especially for those of us who champion agility. Can large bureaucratic organizations really be agile? Or are these two things fundamentally incompatible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bureaucracies thrive on stability and control.
Right.
They're built on hierarchies and clearly defined roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, that's almost the antithesis of agile.
Right.
Which emphasizes adaptability, flexibility, and self-organization. Agile teams need to be able to respond quickly to change, experiment, and learn from their mistakes.
So you have these two seemingly opposing forces at play.
Yeah.
Can they coexist within the same organization? It's a real challenge, and one that Larman's laws force us to grapple with.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
You might be able to force it in, but it's not going to work smoothly.
Exactly.
So we've established that large organizations with their inherent love of stability and control might not be the most natural fit for agility. But does that mean it's a lost cause? Are there ways to make these seemingly incompatible worlds work together?
It certainly requires a radical rethink of how these organizations are structured and operate. We can't just slap an agile label on a traditional bureaucracy and expect it to magically transform.
So where do we even begin? If structure is the soil, as you said earlier, what kind of soil do we need to cultivate to allow agility to flourish?
One crucial aspect is the distribution of power.
Okay.
In traditional hierarchies, decision-making authority is concentrated at the top,
Right.
creating bottlenecks and slowing down the entire system.
That classic pyramid structure.
Yeah.
Where information has to climb all the way to the top and then trickle back down.
Yeah.
Not exactly a recipe for speed or flexibility.
Exactly. To create an adaptable organization, we need to distribute power more broadly.
Okay.
This means empowering teams to make decisions, giving them access to the information they need, and fostering a culture of trust and transparency.
Okay, so less top-down control, more autonomy at the team level. But how do you actually make that shift happen? I imagine it's easier said than done, especially in organizations that have been operating a hierarchical way for decades.
It definitely requires a fundamental shift in mindset and a willingness to challenge the status quo. It means moving away from rigid job descriptions and hierarchies towards more fluid roles and responsibilities.
So instead of everyone having a very specific, clearly defined box, you're saying we need to create more overlap, more fluidity.
Exactly. Think of it like a jazz ensemble. Each musician has their instrument and their expertise, but they also improvise and collaborate, responding to each other in real time.
That's a great analogy. So in an organization, it would be less about staying in your lane and more about contributing your skills wherever they're needed most.
Yes, and this requires investing in people's development, not just their technical skills, but also their judgment, critical thinking, and collaborative abilities.
So not just about restructuring the org chart, it's about empowering people to make decisions and take ownership of their work.
Precisely. It's about creating a culture of distributed leadership where expertise and influence are valued more than formal authority.
Okay.
And that leads us to another crucial element, fostering a culture of experimentation and learning.
Because in a fast-paced environment, you can't just sit back and wait for instructions. You need to be able to try new things, adapt quickly, and learn from your mistakes.
Exactly. But this requires a culture that's comfortable with risk-taking and doesn't punish failure. In traditional hierarchies, failure is often seen as a personal failing, something to be avoided at all costs.
Right, and that creates a culture of fear and risk aversion, which is the opposite of what you need for innovation. So how do we make that shift? How do we go from failure is bad to failure is an opportunity to learn?
It starts with leadership. Leaders need to model this behavior, be open about their own mistakes, and create a safe space for others to do the same. They also need to change how they measure and reward performance.
So less emphasis on hitting every target perfectly and more on celebrating the learning that comes from both successes and failures.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that in a complex and rapidly changing environment, you can't predict everything. The key is to learn and adapt quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, we've talked about distributing power and fostering a culture of experimentation. What other structural changes are needed to make large organizations more adaptable?
Another crucial aspect is creating structures that enable effective collaboration and knowledge sharing. Traditional organizations are often structured in a way that hinders collaboration.
You mean those silos we talked about earlier where departments operate in isolation, hoarding information and resources?
Yes. That kind of structure creates bottlenecks, duplicates effort, and prevents the organization from leveraging its collective intelligence.
So instead of competing with each other, departments need to start working together, sharing knowledge, and coordinating their efforts.
Exactly. And this requires breaking down those silos and creating structures that encourage cross-functional collaboration.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Are we talking about more cross-functional teams, matrix reporting structures, or something else entirely?
It could be a combination of those things, but the key is to create opportunities for people from different parts of the organization to interact, share ideas, and work together on common goals.
So instead of everyone just talking to people within their own little department, you're encouraging them to reach out, connect, and collaborate with colleagues across the organization.
Exactly. This could involve creating shared workspaces, establishing communities of practice, or using technology platforms that facilitate communication and knowledge sharing.
So it's about breaking down those physical and virtual barriers that keep people apart and fostering a more connected and collaborative work environment.
Precisely. And this ties into the importance of creating a culture of transparency and open communication. When information flows freely within the organization, it empowers people to make better decisions, adapt more quickly to changes, and innovate more effectively.
Because you're no longer relying on a few people at the top to make all the decisions.
Yeah.
You're tapping into the collective intelligence and experience of the entire organization.
Exactly. But creating that kind of culture can be challenging, especially in organizations that are used to operating in a more hierarchical, top-down way. It requires a conscious effort to change behaviors and norms.
So what are some concrete steps leaders can take to foster this culture of transparency and open communication?
They need to lead by example, be open and transparent in their own communication, actively solicit feedback from all levels of the organization, and make information readily accessible to everyone.
So no more closed-door meetings and secret decisions.
Ideally, no. The goal is to create a culture where information is shared openly, and everyone feels comfortable speaking up and sharing their ideas.
That's a pretty big shift for a lot of organizations. But I can see how it would create a more engaged and empowered workforce.
Okay, we've talked about distributing power, fostering a culture of experimentation, and creating structures for collaboration. What else is essential for building adaptable organizations?
One more crucial element is embracing continuous improvement.
In a rapidly changing world, it's not enough to adapt to the current situation. You need to be constantly looking for ways to get better, to evolve, to become even more adaptable.
So it's not just about reacting to change, but anticipating it and proactively preparing for it. But how do you cultivate that kind of continuous improvement mindset within a large organization?
It starts with creating a culture of feedback and reflection.
Okay.
This means regularly asking questions like, what's working well? What could be improved? What are we learning from our experiences?
And it's not just about asking those questions. It's about actually acting on the feedback, using it to make adjustments, to try new approaches, to continuously evolve the way the organization works.
Exactly. And this ties into the importance of creating systems and processes that support continuous improvement. This might include things like regular retrospectives, after-action reviews, and feedback loops that ensure learnings are captured and translated into action.
So it's not enough to just have a good idea or a moment of insight. You need to have mechanisms in place to ensure those ideas and insights are actually integrated into the way the organization operates.
Precisely. Continuous improvement needs to be embedded in the DNA of the organization, not just something that's done on an ad hoc basis.
Okay, so to recap, designing organizations for adaptability requires distributing power, fostering a culture of experimentation, creating structures for collaboration and knowledge sharing, and embracing continuous improvement. That's a pretty tall order.
It is, and it's important to remember that these elements are all interconnected. You can't just focus on one or two in isolation. You need to approach it holistically, creating a system where all these elements work together to create a truly adaptable and resilient organization.
It's like building a house. You need strong foundation, solid walls, a well-designed roof, and good ventilation. If one of those elements is missing or weak, the whole structure is compromised.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to designing organizations. You need to think about the entire system, how all the parts fit together, and how they support the overall goal of adaptability.
We've talked a lot about the what of designing adaptable organizations.
Yeah.
But what about the how? How do you actually go about implementing these changes in a real-world organization, especially a large, complex one with existing structures and power dynamics?
That's a great question, and it's what we'll explore in our next segment.
Stay tuned. We're about to get into the nitty-gritty of making these transformations happen. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring why traditional organizations struggle with adaptability and what needs to change to create more agile, responsive structures.
Right.
But I think what everyone wants to know is, how do we actually make it happen? Where do we even begin?
That's the key question, isn't it? And it's where things often go wrong. Companies try to change everything at once, launch massive top-down initiatives, and then wonder why they meet with resistance and ultimately fail.
It's like trying to tune a cruise ship on a dime.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen gracefully.
Exactly. A much more effective approach is to start small and iterate.
Okay.
Choose a specific team, a pilot project, or a department where you can experiment with these new ways of working.
So instead of trying to boil the ocean, you're saying find a smaller pot to experiment with.
Precisely. Find an area where there's both a high potential for impact and a relatively low risk of failure.
Makes sense.
This allows you to test your ideas, get feedback, refine your approach, and demonstrate success before scaling up.
It's like building a prototype before rolling out mass production. Makes sense.
Yeah.
What are some ways companies can prototype these organizational changes?
One idea gaining traction is creating organizational prototypes.
Okay.
These are small, self-contained units within the larger organization that operate according to those new principles of adaptability we've been discussing.
Okay.
They have their own structures, processes, and even a distinct microculture aligned with the desired outcomes.
So it's like creating a mini version of the ideal organization within the existing structure. And if it works, you can replicate it elsewhere.
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is you can experiment with different models.
Okay.
See what works best in your specific context, and then gradually scale up the successful prototypes without disrupting the entire organization.
That sounds much more manageable and less likely to trigger those fears of change we discussed earlier.
Right. And it's important to involve people from all levels of the organization in the change process from the beginning.
Okay, now that's a challenge.
Yeah.
How do you get buy-in, especially from folks who might see these changes as a threat to their own power or status?
It's not about forcing change upon people. It's about creating a shared understanding of why it's necessary and what the benefits will be.
Okay.
Paint a picture of a future that people can get excited about.
So don't just tell them what's changing. Explain why it matters and how it will make their work lives better, right?
Exactly. People are more likely to embrace change when they understand the why behind it and how it aligns with their own aspirations.
Right.
And it's crucial to involve them in the design and implementation of those changes, not just tell them what to do.
Give them a sense of ownership.
Yeah.
Make them part of the solution. That makes a lot of sense. But what about the skills and mindsets needed to thrive in this new environment? Not everyone is going to be comfortable with more autonomy or working in a less structured way.
That's where training and support come in. Equip people with the tools they need to succeed, whether it's training on agile methodologies, collaborative decision-making, or even things like giving and receiving feedback effectively.
So it's not just about changing the structure. It's about giving people the resources and support to adapt to these new ways of working.
Absolutely. And it's about creating a culture where it's safe to ask questions and experiment and learn from mistakes.
Right.
Remember, change is a process, not an event.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
Right? And that journey can be pretty bumpy at times.
It definitely can be. And that's why it's important to celebrate successes and recognize the efforts of those who are contributing to the transformation.
So don't just focus on fixing what's broken. Take the time to acknowledge what's working well and celebrate those wins.
Exactly. Recognizing and appreciating people's efforts goes a long way in building momentum and keeping everyone motivated.
Well, I think this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into Larman's laws and the challenges of organizational change.
Yeah, it is.
We've gone beyond the surface-level explanations to really grapple with the underlying power dynamics and structural shifts needed to create truly adaptable organizations.
For sure.
And it all comes back to that initial question. How do we create a culture where change isn't feared, but embraced? It requires a fundamental shift in mindset at both the individual and organizational level.
Definitely.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one organization might not work for another.
Right.
The key is to understand these principles, experiment, and adapt them to your unique context. And to never stop learning. The world is changing faster than ever, and organizations that can embrace adaptability are the ones that will thrive. So for all you listening, the challenge isn't just understanding these concepts, it's putting them into practice. What actions will you take to create a more adaptable and resilient organization? That's something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.